The Wolf Girl of Devil's River. In 1835, a group of American colonists, led by Dr. Charles Beal, were camped at Lake Espontosa, a renowned haunted location near what is now Carrizo Springs in southwest Texas. Half a mile away from the Beal Group, John Dent and his pregnant wife, Molly Pertool Dent, both from Georgia, had built a brush cabin. Dent had come to Trap Beaver in the Devil's River area, north of the present-day Del Rio, but was also on the run from the law for the murder of a fellow trapper in Georgia. The Dents were to prove fortunate in their choice of a site distant from the lake. A band of Comanches raided the main Beal camp and massacred most of the inhabitants, afterwards throwing the bodies of the victims and their carts into the lake. A haunted location, even at this time, Espontosa Lake had acquired a reputation for ghostly goings, on this incident adding to the store of ill luck and sorrow centering on what, to this day, Mexicans consider a haunted location, the name Espontosa meaning frightful. As Molly was approaching the end of her pregnancy, the couple were reluctant to travel despite the danger of hostile Indians. One night in May 1835, there was a severe thunderstorm and Molly went into labor. She appeared to be having problems with the birth, so Dent decided to ride westwards for help. He arrived at a Mexican goat ranch on the Pecos Canyon and told them desperately about his wife's condition, begging for someone to ride back with him. But as the Mexicans prepared their horses to leave, there was a furious crash of thunder and a bolt of lightning struck Dent from his horse, killing him instantly. After a considerable delay, the goat herders mounted up and followed Dent's directions. However, darkness fell before they had got over the divide to Devil's River, thus delaying the search. Finally, at sunrise the next morning, they located the Dents' isolated cabin, but what they found outside the cabin, in an open brush arbor, was Molly Dent lying dead, alone. She had apparently died in childbirth, but there was no trace of the baby anywhere. The child was never found, but fang marks on the woman's body and numerous wolf tracks over the area made the goat herders naturally assume that the infant had either been devoured or carried off by lobo wolves. First sighting of the wolf girl, but this was just the beginning of the story. 10 years later, in 1845, a boy living at San Felipe Springs, Del Rio, reportedly saw a creature with long hair covering its features that looked like a naked girl attacking a herd of goats in the company of a pack of lobo wolves. The story was ridiculed by many, but still managed to spread back among the settlements. Around a year after this incident, a Mexican woman at San Felipe claimed she had seen 2 large wolves and an unclothed young girl devouring a freshly killed goat. She approached close to the group, she said, before they saw her and ran off. Usually it is very dangerous for humans to eat raw meat. Since the wolf girl never had the chance to learn how to cook a ham or other meats, her body must have become accustomed to digesting uncooked meats just like a wolf. The woman noticed that the girl ran initially on all 4s, but then rose up and ran on 2 feet, keeping close to the wolves. The woman was in no doubt about what she had seen, and the scattering of people in the Devil's River country began to keep a sharp watch for the girl. There were similar reports by others in the region during the following year, and Apache stories told of a child's footprints, sometimes accompanied by handprints, having been found among wolf tracks in sandy places along the river. A hunt was organized to capture the lobo, or wolf, girl of Devil's River as she had now become known, comprising mainly Mexican vaqueros. On the 3rd day of the hunt, the naked girl was sighted near Espontosa Lake, running with a pack of wolves. The cowboys managed to separate the girl from her wolf companions and cornered her in a canyon, where she fought like a wildcat, clawing and biting frantically to keep her freedom. They finally managed to lasso her to keep her still, but while they were tying her up, she began to make frightening, unearthly sounds, somewhere between the scream of a woman and the howl of a wolf. As she howled, the monster wolf from whom she'd become separated appeared and rushed at her captors. Fortunately, one of the cowboys reacted quickly and shot it dead with a pistol, at which the wolf girl fell into a faint. Securely bound, the men were now able to examine the girl and noted that despite a body covered in hair and her wild mannerisms, her appearance was human. Her hands and arms were well muscled but not out of proportion, and she lacked the ability to speak, only making deep, growling noises. She moved smoothly on all fours, but was rather awkward when made to stand up straight. The girl was put on a horse and taken to the nearest ranch, an isolated two-roomed shack amid the desert wilderness. She was put in one of the rooms and unbound, the cowboys offering her a covering for her body and food and water, but she refused, cowering in the darkest corner. They then left her alone for the night, locking the door and posting a guard outside. The only other opening in the room was a small, boarded-up window. But as night fell, the cowboys heard terrifying howls coming from the wolf girl's room. The strange cries carried through the still night air, unsettling her captors and soon finding answers from among the wolf pack in the wilderness beyond the shack. Soon there were long, deep howls coming from all sides as the pack drew closer to the house, and occasionally strange howling screams from the girl answering them from inside her dark room. Suddenly, the large pack of wolves charged into the corrals, attacking the goats, cows, and horses, and bringing the cowboys outside, shooting and yelling to drive them away. In all the confusion, the wolf girl managed to tear the planks from the window and escape into the night. The howls soon abated, and the wolves crept back into the wilderness. The next day, not a trace of the girl could be found, though there were a few unverified reports in the following years of a young hair-covered girl being seen with a wolf pack in the area. No one ever came in close contact with her. Meanwhile, gold had been discovered in California and westward travel had increased significantly. In 1852, a surveying party of frontiersmen searching for a new route to El Paso were riding down to the Rio Grande at a bend far above the mouth of Devil's River. They were almost at the water's edge when they saw at close range, sitting on a sandbar, a young woman suckling two wolf cubs. Suddenly she saw them, quickly grabbed the pups and dashed into the brakes at such a rate that it was impossible for the horsemen to follow. The girl would have been 17 years old that year. After that, she disappeared into the wilderness forever. It is impossible now to know what became of Molly Dent's daughter, presuming that's who the wolf girl was. There were subsequent reports of human-faced wolves in the area right up until the 1930s. L.D. Bertillon wrote in 1937, "During the past 40 years I have in the western country met more than one wolf face strongly marked with human characteristics. The story of the wolf girl of Devil's River reads more like a folk tale than a real feral child case, and the large amount of evidence for what happened is all anecdotal. She does, however, seem to live on in a more subtle form. Her ghost has apparently been seen in the old San Felipe Springs area beside the banks of Devil's River. In 1974, the same year as the Delphos wolf girl in Kansas, a hunter in this area claimed to have seen her again, in the form of a white apparition which vanished before his eyes. Back in the autumn of 1835, when John and Molly Dent had newly arrived in Texas, Molly wrote her mother an odd letter. It said merely, "Dear Mother, the devil has a river in Texas that is all his own, and it is made only for those who are grown. Yours with love, Molly." The Smiling Man. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the U.S. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance, walking headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him. And then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me, and then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. Wah! Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid, but he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance, walking away, just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off of the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. An open Wi-Fi connection. They didn't believe me when I told them there was an open wireless network in range, aptly named free Wi-Fi. It was rather slow, but that's not the problem. You see, we were camping out in the middle of nowhere, Tar Hollow forests for any fellow Ohioans out there. We parked the truck about a mile down the trail, and from there it was a 15-minute drive to the only ramp onto the highway. We were far removed from civilization, to say the least. After we were all done with checking in on Facebook and replying to Snapchats, my friends and I made a game of finding the source of the signal. Marco and Sian went in one direction, Mike and I went the other. 3 minutes later, we were all back at the site. The signal dropped off after 185 paces in the direction I went, and roughly 250 in the opposite. We agreed with Sian's proposal to go in a third direction, so to approximate by triangulation the whereabouts of the source. Marco counted the steps. Mike kept an eye on the signal indicator. Sian and I looked out for anything that remotely resembled a router. About 100 feet in, Mike told Marco to stop counting. The signal was at full strength. I looked around for flashing LEDs or running cables or anything that lit up. Marco suggested it could be a pocket Wi-Fi hotspot that another camper had left behind, though that was unlikely since there was no 3 coverage out there. but we found nothing. We gave up the search and made way back towards the campsite. That's when the Wi-Fi signal disappeared. The sun was setting and it was starting to fog up. A little spooked, we agreed we would pack our stuff and hike back to the truck. When we got back, we realized that we had been robbed. Our bags were torn open, our food supplies were missing, and our tents were toppled. What immediately seemed odd was to me that the thieves hadn't taken our laptops or cameras. Upon closer inspection, all they took were the foods and beverages. And in my opinion, that was the scary part. Needless to say, we crammed whatever we could into our torn-up bags and made a dash for the truck. It wasn't until we got onto the truck that Mike told us to check our phones. The Wi-Fi signal was at full strength again. A chill ran down my spine when I saw the name of the connection. "Run, boys, run!" The Lucien twins. I will never forget the Lucien twins. Even after 10 years, they are still fresh in my memory. Too fresh. It was my first year of teaching when they were in my class. My fresh college diploma was framed on my desk, and I had placed a signed picture of my favorite professor, now deceased, on the wall behind me. In cursive, it read, "To marry my brightest that you may teach the world." I watched over my kindergarten class as if they were my own children. But the Lucien twins were my favorite. There was Abigail, the blonde Awn with a minuscule nose, and Bridget, shorter with brunette hair. Miss Mary, Abigail, would start tugging on my dress before Bridget continued. We were wondering. Abigail would take over if we could go to the sticker box. Bridget would now speak and take a star. And of course there was no way I could say not to the couple. They were irresistible, from their broken sentences to the heart-shaped lockets they wore that were embossed with their names. I could never imagine something happening to them, but fate follows no rules, and something did. Word about the car crash spread around the school faster than the ambulance could reach the hospital. It had been at an intersection where a pickup truck had slammed into the side of their compact car on their Friday morning commute. The driver had still been drunk from the night before. The gas tank was immediately ruptured, spewing the right side of the car with fuel, and flames licked up through the back seat. Bridget was strapped into a car seat above them, and rumor was that Abigail watched her twin burn alive. When the firemen freed Abigail, she threw herself onto the still smoldering bones of Bridget, and her sister's red-hot locket branded itself into her earlobe. The body of her single mother survived, but the toll of the lost daughter sickened her souls. Abigail returned to class 2 weeks later. The hair on the right side of her head was singed and steadily grew back, though the color was darker. A doctor's inspection revealed nothing else wrong with her except a deafness in her right ear. Hushed voices in the school hallways whispered her eardrum imploded by the sheer loudness of her sister's dying screams. But most unnerving was her sister's name, scarred into the lobe of her deaf ear and surrounded by the outline of a heart-shaped locket. From then on, no student would sit on the right side of Abigail, and I had to rearrange the seating charts to place her next to the wall. Abigail seemed content there, in an island of isolation. Before her sister died, they rarely conversed with the other students, and now was no different. In social time, I would hear Abigail talking to the wall in incoherent sentences. "Abigail, honey, what are you saying?" I asked a week after she returned. "Oh, Miss Mary," she said. Then she would pause, waiting, and then we thought. Another pause, silence, and we can't we? "Sure you can, honey," I replied, though the exchange made my hair stand on end. She smiled again and cocked her right ear, the deaf one, to the wall, pausing again, then speaking. She said yes. Then the gibberish continued and the closing bell rang. It wasn't until I drove halfway home that I realized the gaps in Abigail's conversation were where Bridget should be speaking. Months passed, and Abigail became even more of an outcast in the class. The kindergartners came to forget the disaster, and some students even began bullying Abigail. I revised the seating chart again and moved her close to my desk. "Miss Mary," clamored Abigail one day, pulling my dress. She stumbled, and I reached to catch her, but she fell against my professor's portrait on the wall, shattering the protective glass. She picked up the remains, the glass biting deep into her soft palms. She didn't notice. "I'm sorry, Miss Mary," she said, and her voice changed tenor. "We didn't mean to break again a pitch change, your picture." I stopped. It was her first complete sentence since the crash. "It's okay," I said, holding her. Blood from her hands dripped onto me, but it felt cold, and I rushed to bandage it. "I'm sure you will teach the world one day, Miss Mary," she said, her voice continuing the inflections. My heart froze as I read the note on the portrait for the 1,000th time. Abigail couldn't read cursive. "How did you know that?" I asked. "Bridget told me. She talks to him now," she said, curling her streak of darker hair around her finger. "That's not all she tells me. She tells me terrible things sometimes." And I can't stop hearing her. Then she started crying and noticed the glass embedded deep into her hands. She never stops, her voice elevated to a yell. When I took the picture back, her sentences became broken again, and I moved her on the seating chart away from my desk. Over time, the other students realized Abigail's reaction to old objects. They'd bring her in things that they found in the attic, artifacts their grandparents owned, and watched as she cocked her right ear and her sentences become whole or broken when she held them. It became a game to them, listening to the stories she made up. But the effect took an obvious toll on her, and she soon started wearing gloves, even in the dead heat of summer. But one boy, larger than the others, a brute known for his bullying, liked the look on Abigail's face as they pushed artifacts into her squirming palms. He was the quickest to see the fear that she felt when they once gave her an old bullet shell and ran home afterwards to find an old box in his basement his parents forbade him to open. Inside was his great-grandfather's Nazi uniform, a warden at a concentration camp, and he twisted off one of the buttons. The next day he found Abigail on the playground and pinned her against the chain-link fence. He ripped the gloves off and forced the button into her hand, tightly closing her fingers about it. When she began screaming, he only laughed and closed the fist tighter. I reached them too late. When I pulled the boy off her, she was sobbing uncontrollably, both her hands locked into fists. She dropped the button like it was searing hot, but refused to open the other fist until the paramedics arrived and knocked her out with anesthesia. Only then could they pull her severed right ear out, torn off by her bloody fingernails with Bridget still written on the lobe. But most terrifying of all was when she screamed. I could hear two voices screaming. Late-night drive. I lay on a table next to a roaring fire. My hands were bound, and I was surrounded by figures in black robes. The beautiful young woman who looked like she was still in her teens approached me, holding a nasty-looking knife encrusted with jewels. "Please don't do this," I said. She flashed a wicked grin and raised the knife over me, holding her breath for a moment before she plunged it toward my chest. 12 hours earlier, I'd never been a big fan of trucks. Why I drove one for a living was beyond me. I think it started out like so many other things. You just think you'll do it for a while, and the next thing you know, 10 years have passed and you're still doing the same thing. If this story was just about letting time slip away because I was too scared or too complacent to make a change, this would be a very boring story indeed. But it's not. There are many people who see things they shouldn't, or more to the point who see things they shouldn't, or more to the point who see things they wish they hadn't. Most of these people make a choice to bury the forbidden memory deep in their subconscious and never think of it again. They cope through any number of methods, including drugs, alcohol, or other means. If they can't cope with it, they leave a note, a grieving family, and a lot of questions. One of the reasons they choose not to tell anyone about their experience is being labeled crackpot, conspiracy theorist, lunatic. Those are some of the nicer things these unfortunate souls get called. Then there's the censoring and blacklisting. Oh, it's all very subtle so as not to be discovered, but that doesn't make it any less real. My story started on a bright, sunny day when it seemed like nothing could possibly go wrong. That should be my first clue. But how could I have expected any less? Driving down the country road with the window down, the sun shining, a balmy 80 degrees outside, the music blaring from the radio as I sang along, desperately trying to stay in key. The fields were full of vegetables in their prime growing cycle. It was like everything was perfect for that one moment. I just wish that moment could have lasted. When my front passenger side tire blew, my good feelings were shattered. I went 10 rounds with the steering wheel trying to keep the truck on the road, but it was futile. Finally, having no other option, I yanked the wheel hard toward the left. It teetered on the edge of balance for a moment before the wheel bit into the asphalt. Going 55 when the wheel dug in was catastrophic. The truck suddenly turned into a gymnast doing a routine on the mat. Fortunately, I had already delivered my parts for the day. If not, I would have worried about a drive shaft or a transmission flying through the plywood wall that separates the cab from the back of the box truck and turning me into a bloody pancake. I think I had enough to worry about as the truck flew through the air, taking me with it. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as the truck's momentum turned it sideways and started it rolling. I had no idea how many times it flipped. I just knew how hard I was praying and how tightly I gripped the steering wheel. When it finally stopped and settled, the truck was sitting back on its wheels. I thanked God for small favors and for keeping me safe. I won't say I went unhurt. When you're flipping through the air, everything in the cab becomes a missile. I got hit by my water bottle, my bag of potato chips, my phone, even my lunchbox tagged me a couple of times. I was sure I would have bruises when I got home. After the truck settled, I turned off the engine, unbuckled my seatbelt, and slowly climbed out of the cab. My first few steps were tentative, making sure everything worked and nothing was broken. After I stretched and felt around for injuries, I took a slow lap around the truck. 3 of the 4 tires were flat, with the rear driver's side being the only holdout. There was dripping coming from underneath that seemed like different liquids mixed together. I decided it would be a good idea to get whatever I was going to salvage out of the cab quickly, just in case one of those liquids happened to be gasoline. I grabbed everything I could and went down the road 50 yards or so before setting the armful of stuff down on the berm. I sat down in the grass along the road and looked at the truck. I could see the top had been bent. It looked comical, as if it was leaning over and needed help to stand up straight. Thinking of that reminded me that I needed help. The road wasn't very well traveled. It was a 2-lane country road I had been driving on for nearly an hour, and I hadn't passed more than a handful of cars. I dug through my pile of rescued items and found my phone. I really wish I hadn't. The screen was splintered. I tried to turn it on, but it was no use. I wouldn't be calling anyone with it ever again. I looked up the road and down, but all I could see were endless miles of corn growing in the field. I hadn't seen a house for a while, so I decided I would walk in the direction I had been going. I gathered what was useful and stowed it in my pockets. The rest went in my lunchbox, and off I went looking every bit like a kid walking home from school. The walk worked the stiffness out of my limbs and revealed whatever injuries I had were minor. It had been 20 minutes, and I was beginning to wonder if anyone lived on this road when, out of nowhere, a house appeared. It looked old and run down, but it was better than nothing. I turned up the long driveway, hoping the residents were friendly and I wasn't about to have my torso redecorated with buckshot. Just then I passed a no trespassing sign nailed to a tree beside the driveway. I hesitated and considered turning back to look for the next house when I saw a man coming towards me on a tractor. It was already too late. He pulled up beside me and killed the engine. He was big, wearing overalls, which he filled with a belly, but I could see bulging arms from a lifetime of hard work. His silent stare made me feel the most uncomfortable I had in a long time. "Afternoon," I said, waiting for some response. He continued staring as if I were some alien being that had wandered onto his property. "I had a little accident back the road a couple of miles, and I was wondering if I could use your phone to call a tow truck." He leaned over and spit off the side of the tractor. "That's so," he said. "Yeah, unfortunately," I said. "A tire blew out on me and I lost control." "Ha," he said. He eyed me up and down, making me feel more than a little uncomfortable, then started the tractor and turned it back toward the house without a word. Since I was still alive and hadn't heard any banjos playing, I decided this was his idea of a yes. I followed along behind the tractor as we headed toward the house. Not once did he look back to see if I was following. When he got to the front of the house, he yelled inside, "Darlene!" Immediately, an overweight, middle-aged woman appeared in the doorway wearing a ragged dress with an apron over it. "This fella says he was in an accident down the road and needs to call a tow truck," the man said. But the phone. She started but was instantly silenced by a glare from the man. She hung her head. "She'll show you where the phone is," the man told me. Then he drove away on the tractor. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience, Mom." I said. "It's no trouble," she said, looking up but not meeting my eyes. "The phone's in here." She stepped inside and held the door open for me to follow. The inside of the house was a stark contrast to the outside. It was clean and very well kept. I was surprised to see the portraits hanging on the wall had no dust on them at all. She led me down a hallway that ended in an immaculate kitchen. It was like someone had dropped it here straight out of a 50s TV show. I was so busy taking in the pristine condition of the room that I completely missed the phone hanging on the wall. She turned and pointed it out to me. I reached for it, but wiped off my hands before picking it up so I wouldn't leave any marks. When I put it up to my ear, I heard a strange sound I couldn't identify, but no dial tone. I clicked the receiver a few times, but still got no dial tone. "It's not working," I said. She took the phone from me and tried to use it, but was unsuccessful as well. "I apologize," she said gently, hanging the phone back on its cradle. "The storm must have knocked it out." "What storm?" I said. She hesitated. "We had a storm last night and lost power," she said, avoiding my eyes. "It must have taken out the phones as well. Didn't you know about this before?" "We don't use the phone much," she said. "If you hadn't come, I might not have known it until tomorrow or the next day." "Wow," I said. "I can't imagine going days without using my phone." I mean, we don't really have that many people to call," she said, twisting her apron into a knot. "Maybe I should try another house," I said. "Their phone might be working." "I doubt it," she said. "But you're welcome to try. Our nearest neighbor is 3 miles down the road." The thought of walking another 3 miles held no appeal to me, but if their phone was working and I could get a ride out of here, it would be worth it. There was something odd going on here, and I didn't want to be part of it. In the back of my mind, the banjo players were tuning up. "That's fine," I said. "Would you mind if I use your bathroom before I go?" "Oh no, not at all," she said, brightening. "It's the second door on your left." Her sudden mood swing gave me the distinct impression she didn't want me here. I had no desire to be any place I'm not wanted, so no problem with me. I stepped into the bathroom and was once again impressed by the pristine nature of everything in the room. I felt almost sacrilegious using the toilet. When I was done, I washed my hands. As I glanced in the mirror, I saw a shadow move from the window behind me. I'd swear someone had just been looking in. I dried my hands and tried to put the towel back exactly where it was before exiting the room. I stepped out and nearly ran into the man. "Did you make your call?" he said. "Couldn't. The phone's not working." "Home," he said. "I was going to walk down to your neighbor's house and see if maybe their phone's working." "It won't," he said. "How do you know that? The phones are all on the same line. If one goes down, they all go down. Why not stay here for a while and try again later?" There was something wrong with his face. Suddenly I realized he was trying to smile. The problem was it came across as super creepy. The other problem was I had no reason not to wait here. No reason I could put my finger on. No reason except the creeping suspicion in the back of my mind that something wasn't right here. But how do I tell that to a farmer who's half again my size and looks like he could bend me into a pretzel? "Sure, I'll stick around for a bit," I said, wearing my friendliest smile. We went back into the kitchen. His wife seemed startled to see me return. She seemed even more startled to see her husband smiling. I sat in a chair at the table. "Okay," I thought, "just sit here and take a break. Don't make eye contact, and whatever you do, don't accept any. Would you like a drink?" he said. "Sure," my mouth said, making my mind say, "Dough." The woman brought over a glass of water, and I tried to just sip it, but it was nice and cold. I hadn't drunk anything in a while and didn't realize how thirsty I was. I downed it in one go. At least I kept enough self-control that I didn't give a big "ah" at the end. I sat the glass down on the table. "Would you like another?" she said. "No, thank you. I was just thirsty from walking." "What do you deliver with your truck?" he said. "Car parts," I said. "I deliver to local repair shops." They both wore the polite, "Isn't that interesting?" looks that told me it wasn't interesting to them at all. Darlene rose from her seat. "I should be starting super," she said. "Would you like to stay and have supper with us?" "Oh, no, I don't want to trouble you," I said. "It's no trouble," the man said. "I really should be going." "Where?" he said. "Why don't you have supper with us and you can try the phone again after? That sounds great, but we're not good enough for you to spend time with," he said. That's not at all what I was going to say. I stood there, his glare burning through me. "Of course I'll stay for supper." His hardened facial expression melted into a smile.
"Great," he said. "I'll go wash up in the upstairs bathroom and you can use the one down here." I smiled, but my mind was screaming, "What did you get us into?" I followed him out of the kitchen and went into the bathroom while he went upstairs.
I could hear the steps creaking under his weight as he ascended. I stood there holding the bathroom door, looking at my escape, the front door a handful of steps away. But where would I go? Back out on the road where he could easily find me. Maybe I could flag down a passing car before he knew I was gone. But then again, who knew when a car would go by? This wasn't exactly the interstate. In the end, I gave up and went into the bathroom to wash up. Not knowing exactly what that meant, other than washing my hands, I decided to wash my face too, just in case. As I dried my face, I saw the shadow in the window again. I tried to play it cool and put the towel back on the rack, then slid over toward the window and darted toward it. The shadow was too quick and disappeared before I could get a look. I came back over to the mirror and stared into the tired eyes of a man in his late 30s who had traded his dreams for a secure job. "You must be crazy," my reflection said. "Why don't you crawl out that window and get away from here?" I turned and looked at the tantalizing window. When I turned back to the mirror, my reflection was still there. "You want me to take the risk of escaping while you sit nice and comfy in your frame," I said. "Why don't you escape?" My reflection glanced at the window but didn't make a move toward it. "That's what I thought," I said to the reflection. I stepped out of the bathroom and was greeted by the most delicious smell. I glided into the kitchen and drank in the smell of glorious food. "What's that amazing smell?" I said. Darlene jumped and turned around, brandishing a large spoon in self-defense. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," I said. "It's all right," she said, her cheeks turning red. "I'm not used to anyone coming to the kitchen until I call for them. Do you need any help?" "Help," she said, looking at me like she didn't understand the word. "Yeah, help, like with setting the table," I said. "Oh no, I always take care of that," she said, "but thank you." I went to the table and sat down, watching her glide through the kitchen with practiced ease. In no time, plates, glasses, and silverware appeared on the table. I noticed 5 place settings, including the one where I sat. I was about to ask about the others when she yelled, "Supper!" It startled me when I realized it was the loudest I'd heard her say anything. The man came through the door first, followed by a boy maybe 11 years old. Next came a shapely young woman who seemed to be in her teenage years and in the throes of puberty. I quickly glanced away from the fact that she was developing all the right curves in all the right places, and her face looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. The man's eyes bored into mine, and I suddenly found the pattern on the dishes to be the most interesting thing I'd ever seen. Darlene brought over a large bowl and a plate full of biscuits. 3 hands each grabbed a biscuit. The man took 2 and began to disassemble them on their plates, then poured the gravy over the remnants of the biscuit. "Well, what are you waiting for?" the man said to me. "Help yourself." I took a biscuit and separated it in half, then poured gravy over it that had chunks of meat in it. "What kind of meat is this?" I said, inhaling the tantalizing aroma. "Chicken," Darlene said, darting her eyes toward the man. "It smells amazing." I said, picking up my fork and diving into the gravy. "Soaked biscuit. Aren't you forgetting something?" The man said. I looked around and found all eyes on me as my fork froze halfway to my mouth. I paused and set it down, then folded my hands as the others had already done. "Dear Lord," the man said, "thank you for the hands that prepared this meal and for blessing us with another day of life. Please help this fella to find his final destination and bless us to do your bidding. Amen." I opened my eyes, and everyone else was already devouring their meal. I picked up my fork, checking to be sure I wasn't going to be admonished for eating this time, and began devouring as well. To call the simple fare delicious would be an understatement. It was hands down the most incredibly tasty meal I'd ever eaten. I shot Darlene my biggest smile. "This is really delicious," I said. The man glared at me. The children shot curious looks at me. Darlene blushed and looked away. "What?" I said. "We're not big on compliments around here," the man said. "We do what needs to be done and don't expect a fuss to be made about it." "Oh, sorry." I said, unsure if I was really being made to apologize for complimenting someone. The man grunted and everyone went back to eating. I kept my eyes on my plate to avoid any further mistakes. When my plate was empty, I looked at the 2 remaining biscuits. "You can have another if you want," the man said. "Only if no one else wants it," I said. The man looked around the table. "It's still on the plate, ain't it? Yes?" Then nobody else wants it? I tentatively reached for the delectable lump of dough, waiting to see if anyone would change their mind. When no one did, I pulled it apart and doused it in the golden gravy. Within 2 minutes, it was gone. I sat back, feeling satisfied as Darlene cleared the table and did the dishes. I considered offering to help, but after the compliment speech, I was pretty sure that wouldn't go over very well. "Do you mind if I try the phone again?" I said. The man gave me a dismissive wave, which I took for yes, and I left the table only to be disappointed by the continued lack of a dial tone. Still no luck. The man said, "Nope. Why don't you stay here for the night?" he said. "Oh no," I said. "I couldn't impose on you like that." "It's not imposing," he said. "We have a spare room. I couldn't really." "Okay, how about this?" he said. "You stay the night. If the phone doesn't work in the morning, I'll drive you home." "You do that?" he smiled. "Absolutely. How can I refuse?" I said. "Great, I'll show you to your room." I followed him up the stairs to the end of a long hallway. There were 3 doors on the left-hand side and 2 doors on the right. We went to the last door on the left and into a beautiful bedroom. "Wow, this is amazing," I said. He looked around. "It's just a room," he said. "If you need to use the bathroom, it's across the hall. Thank you very much," I said, holding out my hand. He grabbed it and shook it with a wide smile. "My pleasure." I waited until he left to collapse to the floor in agony at my hand that had been crushed by his handshake. The funny thing was, I didn't think he was trying to hurt me. It was just his natural strength. I made a mental note to never anger this man. I set my lunchbox of belongings I had brought from the truck on the bed and started going through them. I pulled out the small flashlight and set it on the nightstand. Next was the keychain-sized can of pepper spray. I looked at it for a moment, then stuck it in my pants pocket. I stuck the multi-tool in my pocket as well, then set the rest, mainly consisting of snacks, in the drawer. I wandered over to the window and looked out. It must have faced the back of the house because all I could see was a barn and a lot of field. The boy and the man were out there busying themselves with chopping firewood and throwing it on a pile. I didn't think too much of it since it was July and winter would be here soon enough. The sun was almost down, and with it my last thoughts of going back to the truck or trying to walk to another house. I'd heard stories about things that roamed the countryside in the dark. I'd seen my share of them and knew they were nothing to be trifled with. This place was nice, and the people were friendly in their own quirky way. I decided to go to the bathroom and get ready for bed. I opened my door and almost ran into the girl as she was reaching for the bathroom door. "Sorry," I said. "Would you like to go first?" she said, looking down. "No, you go ahead." She looked at me for a moment and grinned. I backed into my room and closed the door. The last thing I needed was the man catching me making eyes at his teenage daughter. I searched the room, looking for anything to take my mind off her. There was no TV, no radio, nothing to distract me. In desperation, I opened a drawer and a Bible stared back at me. I shrugged. Maybe the good book will help me keep my mind off bad things. I flipped it open, stopped on a random page and read James 1:14, 15, 14, 14, 15, 14, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. 15 then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Great, I thought, slamming the book closed and tossing it back in the drawer. Just then there was a light tapping at the door. I went to it and opened it only to find the girl standing there just inches from me. "I'm done if you'd like to use the bathroom now," she said. "Thank you," I said. She nodded and walked down the hall. It took every ounce of willpower not to watch her walk away in her nightdress. I darted across the hall and shut the door. 5 minutes later, I opened the door to go back to my room, but found the way blocked by the man. He stared down at me. "Enjoying yourself?" he said. "I'm sorry," I said, starting to sweat. "Is the room okay? Are you enjoying yourself?" "Oh yes, very much, thank you." He smiled and nodded, then stepped into the bathroom and closed the door. I glanced down the hallway, and there stood Darlene. She saw me and stopped, then went into her bedroom. I turned and went into my room, closed the door, and tried to shake off this eerie feeling that no one wanted me here, but they were all pretending they did. I laid down in the comfortable bed, leaving my clothes on. I'm not really sure why, I just didn't feel right taking them off. It didn't take long for me to drift off to sleep, hoping the morning would come soon and I would be out of here tomorrow. I don't know what woke me, but the room was dark when I opened my eyes. There was moonlight beaming in from the windows, bathing the room in a pale glow. I sat up and looked outside to see a roaring fire in the backyard. I tried to get up and look, but someone was standing in my way. It was Darlene. She was standing beside the bed, staring at me. "Is everything okay?" I said hesitantly. She didn't answer, just stared at me blankly, as if she were sleepwalking. I went to the other side of the bed, but someone was there too. It was the girl. She also was staring at me with a blank look. I tried to slide to the end of the bed, but the man and the boy were standing there, staring as well. They were all dressed in black robes. I backed up until my back was against the headboard. "What is this?" I said, my eyes darting back and forth from one person to the next. No one answered. It was eerily silent. I was hard-pressed to hear if they were even breathing. My heart was beating so loud. My mind was reeling. I was in full panic mode. I had no idea what they wanted, but I was sure it wasn't good. I thought about making a break for it, but they had me surrounded. I started thinking in terms of the weakest link. The girl was standing beside the bed. Surely I could push past her before one of the others could get a hold of me. It would have been a good plan if the door was on the wall beside the bed, but it wasn't. It was on the wall at the foot of the bed, which meant pushing past her, then trying to get past the man and the boy before reaching the door. I was past regretting ever seeing this house. I was only concerned with getting out alive. While I was thinking about escape, they made their move. They all grabbed me at the same time. It happened so fast I had no way of avoiding it. I tried to pull away, but their grip was like iron. It was even impossible to yank out of the girl's grip. They held me down and tied my hands with rope. Then they lifted me out of the bed and walked me down the stairs. We walked through the kitchen and out the back door where the blazing fire awaited. Surrounded by a dozen people dressed in similar black robes, we stepped inside the circle of people and stopped just before the fire. It was burning so hot I began to sweat. The man stood behind me and held me in an iron grip. Darlene stepped up to the fire, then turned and addressed the group. "Once again, our Lord had provided a sacrifice," she said, making me go into sheer convulsions of panic. The man gripped me tighter, nearly making me scream with pain. He picked me up and laid me on a picnic table. All I could think of was a barbecue, and I was the prize pig. Darlene began murmuring in some language I didn't know. It was repeated by the rest of the group. Even the young boy was murmuring and looking at me with malice in his eyes. The sounds reached a fever pitch as they raised their hands and looked to the sky. I tried to take advantage of the moment and roll off the table, but the man's grip on my shoulders was like a vise. They reached a crescendo, and the sound died down as they lowered their hands and locked all eyes on me. I knew my time had come. Darlene turned toward me and pulled out a wicked-looking dagger that was covered in gemstones. She took a step toward me, then turned and handed it to her daughter. She took it in two hands with reverence, then held it by the hilt and started toward me. The once angelic face had taken on a menacing grin. She approached the table, receiving approving looks from all those around as they closed the circle in tight. "Please don't do this," I said. She flashed a wicked grin and raised the knife over me, holding her breath for a moment before she plunged it toward my chest. I was out of options. I did the one thing I swore I'd never do again. My hands darted up with inhuman speed and caught hers, holding the knife at bay. She struggled, putting all her weight into the downward thrust, but my hands had already grown larger and hairier. Her eyes grew wide as she drank in my transformation, watching as my arms, legs, and chest grew insanely strong muscles and became covered in fur. Her shock was magnified when I flexed my arms and shattered her wrists, bending them backward and plunging the knife into her chest. Her mouth fell open to scream, and I filled it with my claws, ripping straight through the back of her head. I grabbed her throat and ripped it out. She fell, blood pouring from her neck, her eyes frozen in a state of shock. The man tried to wrestle me back down, but I towered over him, grabbing him by the torso and throwing him down on the table, shattering it and his back. I grabbed his arms and legs and twisted them together, hearing the bones snap as I made him into a human pretzel. Darlene was next. She, like the others, had come to the realization that their little ceremony had gone wrong. I leaped in front of her, grabbed her arms, and ripped them out of their sockets. I then stabbed her in the heart with the sharp, broken bones. Next, I grabbed the boy, opened my mouth, shoved his head inside, and crushed it with the snap of my jaws. I used my animal instincts to track down each of the escaping cultists and eviscerated them one by one. When the last one was dead, I slowly walked back to the house. My adrenaline bled off as the danger level dropped. I slowly transformed back into my human form and stood by the fire, looking from body to body as puddles of blood formed around them. As I walked past the man, he yelled, "You've taken everything from me." I stopped and slowly turned, looking at his broken limbs twisted at unnatural angles. I stepped over and stood beside him. "You were perfectly willing to take everything from me," I said. "How many others have there been just like me? How many innocent souls cry out from the unmarked graves you buried them in somewhere in the wilderness after you inflicted unthinkable torture on them? You say, I've taken everything from you, and yet you still draw breath. What happens when one predator meets another?" He tried to look away, but couldn't move his head. "One of two things," I continued. "Either they stare each other down and go their separate ways, or they fight to the death. You had a chance to let me go my way. You thought I was weak, and in the end I showed you your folly." I stepped over and ripped the sacrificial knife from the dead girl's chest, stepped back over to him, placed it to his throat, and slashed across, watching the spray of blood drain what was left of his useless life. "Now I've taken everything from you," I said, dropping the knife as the light faded from his eyes. I went to the fire and picked up a piece of burning wood, then threw it through the kitchen window. I walked down the driveway and onto the road. The moonlight lit my way as the sound of crackling wood grew less the further I walked down the road toward the place I called home. You may wonder why I wrote this. You might say I was telling on myself, and the police might have a few questions for me. That's the benefit of people who don't want to believe those who say they've seen extraordinary things. The truth remains shrouded behind the mask of doubt and unbelievability. The real reason I wrote this is as a warning. Never take strangers for granted. You never know who or what they are. Thank you for watching our first video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and push the notification icon as we upload more. We plan on bringing you the best horror stories on the internet. And remember, everyone, don't be afraid.